40 años del Premio Nobel Alternativo. Diálogos Right Livelihood Award, Prometeo.
Bienvenidas a todos y todas. A very warm welcome from Sweden and from Colombia and from New York to wherever you are and in whichever time zone. We are very excited about the upcoming 90 minutes where we will be discussing the question of world peace and disarmament with some amazing speakers and especially with you, our audience. This is an event which we would have hoped would have taken place in person in Medellin, Colombia. And as so many events this year, that was not possible. And we're even more excited that technology makes it possible for us to be together in this way. And the reason why we as the Right Livelihood Foundation and the Poetry Festival in Medellin, who are one of our laureates, are doing this format together, or at least the occasion that we took to do it together, is also to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Poetry Festival in Medellin and the 40th anniversary of the Right Livelihood Award, the award that we've been presenting here in Stockholm, Sweden, since 1980, an award with the idea that there are so many good, practical, concrete solutions around the world to many of the urgent challenges that are pressing humanity so hard, and that there is so much courage and hope to be found in the projects that we give awards to. And a shining example, an outstanding example, of course, of this idea is the International Poetry Festival, Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín, which received the Right Livelihood Award in 2006. So it's a real honor to be doing this together with you and to have with me here Fernando Rendón, the founder of the International Poetry Festival of Medellin, who is now organizing a whole series of digital meetings to replace what should have been the 30th Poetry Festival this summer. And I would like to ask you, Fernando, to give us some background and your welcome remarks, which you will be doing in Spanish. And for everyone who prefers to have it in English, you can read what Fernando is going to say on the platform on which you're following. The floor is yours.
Gracias. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Presento mi saludo fraterno a Ole von Uexkull, director ejecutivo de la Fundación Right Livelihood Award, conocido también como el Premio Nobel Alternativo, que auspicia el ciclo de 3 foros que comienza hoy alrededor del tema la paz mundial, el desarme y el COVID. Saludo también a Ulrika, alta funcionaria del Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo PNUD, al laureado Alyn, asesor de Naciones Unidas para el Desarme Nuclear, y a la activista, poeta y cantante surafricana Gcina Mhlophe. Aunque embrionarias, las colectividades primitivas hace 100.000 años desarrollaron un diálogo con la naturaleza por la que guardaban un respeto profundo, como se refleja incluso hoy en las comunidades primitivas actuales, unidas por intereses materiales y espirituales compartidos, el trabajo y la resistencia comunes a la adversidad que no observan las sociedades altamente desarrolladas, pareciendo comprender aquellas mejor que Occidente cuánto debemos cuidar la coherencia y organicidad de la sociedad humana y el entorno que nos rodea y procura nuestra existencia. Las sociedades más agresivas desplegarán durante más de 40 siglos una guerra infinita. 14.513 guerras han costado 1.240 millones de muertos y en alianza con todas las manifestaciones destructivas del llamado progreso material están a las puertas de destruir la tierra. La cultura democrática es el fundamento de todas las sociedades verdaderas. La esencia de la democracia es el directo poder del pueblo sobre su destino. Pero en su sentido estricto, la democracia plena no ha existido jamás. El poder puede comprarse y venderse. El dinero compra y corrompe casi todo. Los reyes se dicen puestos por los dioses en el escaparate sanguinolento de la historia. Dictadores se imponen a sangre y fuego. Las dictaduras que simulan democracia se multiplican. La democracia retrocede cada día en el mundo. El absolutismo de derecha gobierna con mano de hierro. 9 de cada 10 personas en el mundo respiran aire contaminado. Más de 2.000 millones de personas, 40%, no tienen acceso al agua potable. Dentro de 10 años, 700 millones de personas más deberán desplazarse por falta de agua. 15 millones de hectáreas de bosques se deforestan cada año. Las áreas cubiertas de hielo en el Ártico se han reducido en un 45% durante los últimos años. De esta manera, muchas ciudades costeras en el planeta desaparecerán en breve tiempo. 1/3 de las especies marinas están en riesgo por el cambio climático. 58% de los animales se han extinguido. 1 millón de especies animales están en peligro de desaparecer. En 2050, 4.000 millones de seres humanos vivirán en el desierto. La humanidad se ve en un callejón sin salida. Nuestra forma de habitar el mundo y de transformarlo vive una profunda crisis. No se puede matar la vida, no se puede aniquilar a los pueblos. La guerra infinita contra todas las formas de la vida debe terminar. No obstante, subyace una pulsión universal de vida. Millones de personas luchan contra la guerra, contra el cambio climático, contra el envenenamiento del aire y del agua, contra la destrucción de los bosques, contra la miseria material y cultural. El tiempo que nos queda es breve en el reloj de la destrucción. Los pueblos pueden oponerse y detener la mano de las fuerzas de la aniquilación. Deben levantarse, alentados por una visión renovadora de la existencia. La poesía, el arte y el espíritu humanista de salvaguardia de la vida, revolucionaria en su esencia, revelan cada día la potencia creadora de la tierra. Una poderosa cultura de la vida se abre paso desde siempre. Bienvenidos todos a este vital foro convocado y organizado por la Fundación Right Livelihood Award, que cumple 40 años de existencia, y por el Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín, que celebra 30 años desde su fundación. Muchas gracias, Ole.
Thank you so much, Fernando, for this broad overview of the topic, and who could give a better account of the integrated understanding that we should have of world peace than you from Colombia, who've been at the heart of not just an armed struggle, but who are also at the heart of ecological conflicts, and who have built up this festival over 3 decades to meet this challenge with arts and with educational work that is going on year-round in Medellin. Thank you so much for this amazing initiative, and thank you for setting the ground for what we're now going to discuss. And I say the issue is extremely broad. We are thus very fortunate to have speakers with us who really cover the different aspects of the topic of world peace. Ulrika Moderator of UNDP, who can talk about the human development dimension of peace and certainly the climate dimension of it. Alyn Ware, also a Right Livelihood Laureate, who's going to talk about nuclear disarmament, and Gcina, Mhlophe from South Africa, who can talk about the artistic dimension and the human condition inherent in why we fight. And we have you as our audience, and we really look forward to engaging with you. So a brief explanation of what's going to happen over the coming 75 minutes that we have left is that I will now very soon give the floor for 10-minute introductions to our amazing speakers, and I will try, if I can digitally, to keep you speakers to your 10 allotted minutes, so that we then have the possibility to discuss first between the three speakers, and then also based on the questions that are sent in by our audience on the various channels where you are following today's seminar. So the way this is set up, you can enter your comments on wherever platform you are following us, and we are collecting comments, and we'll make sure that at least some of them come up for debate later in the discussion. And without further ado, it is now my great pleasure to give the digital floor to Ulrika, who we know here in Sweden very well as a former state secretary, also in the Foreign Office. And even before that, we in civil society know her as a very influential civil society figure for long, who really has the questions of human development and climate change and the sustainable development goals very close to her heart, and who sadly left Sweden here, but to work as Assistant Secretary General at UNDP. And it is from that perspective that I ask you, Ulrika, to share your thoughts on the subject. Welcome.
Fernando and friends of Right Livelihood Foundation, the Medellín Poetry Festival and beyond. I think I got on to the camera when I was saying that. Just thank you so much, Ole, and greetings, saludos, also a Fernando. It's of course my great pleasure to join you today for this forum. I would have loved to be in Medellin, a city that I find fascinating alongside with so many parts of Colombia, but hopefully later on we will be able to meet in real life. COVID-19, the pandemic, has exposed the full extent of human vulnerability, perhaps for the first time in a generation. And human development, as we measure, as you know, within UNDP, PNUD, the combined measurement of world's education, health, and living standards, is on course to decline for the first time since measurement began in 1990. And then you should know that during the economic crisis, 2008, we only saw a minor change, a shift. This pandemic, as we know, it's a health crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, and increasingly, and in many countries from the very beginning, it was a socioeconomic crisis, and I will speak about that and what it means for our future, our common future. We see up to 100 million more people being pushed into extreme poverty this very year as a consequence. We see 1.4 children affected by school closures, and we know that perhaps some of these kids, especially the girls, will not be able to go back to school, even when schools open again. We see more than 770,000 confirmed deaths as a result of the pandemic, and governments and societies face unprecedented policy, regulatory, and fiscal choices as they act to save lives and set a course for what we would like to see, a sustainable future. You've seen the UN use the term building back. Well, I don't believe that we can go back. We really need to build something better for the future. The economic shocks caused by lockdowns and border closures are rippling through the global value chains, with the informal sector hardest hit. And then we should know that 60% of the global workforce are to be found within the informal sector. Governments already have limited fiscal space, and it's eroding, and governments are seeking debt relief to free up urgently turned down. And this pandemic is the time for renewed multilateralism. It has been said many times that this is really a case that shows that we need to come together for global solutions to global challenges. As our UN Secretary General has said, the COVID-19 is meaning the whole of humanity, so the whole of humanity must fight back. And multilateralism is also in a time of a global crisis at the same time as we need it the most. It's now 75 years ago that world leaders took the decision to create a UN in a world that was in crisis after the Second World War. Like climate change, COVID-19 offers proof, if proof is, by the way, still needed, that all life on Earth is connected. Scientists, they have warned us for years, and you're fully aware of this, that the unrestricted deforestation, illegal wildlife trade, and zoonoses would unleash uncontrollable pandemics. And the only solution lies in working together in an integrated way. This crisis has exposed the need for and the benefits of multilateral cooperation as countries continue to share data, knowledge, good practices, and to co-invest, including in the discovery, of course, of a vaccine that needs to be distributed to all countries and all people across the world. Yet, as we know, and Fernando, you spoke about this as well, the pandemic has also provoked the opposite reaction. States erecting protective barriers, fear fueling anti-immigrant sentiments, arguments for protectionism and against global cooperation. So we know now that public support has to be mobilized for the case that national interests is best served addressing global weaknesses and building global strength together. Renewed and reinvigorated multilateralism is the best way to plot a path through this crisis towards a more resilient future. And right now, governments and societies face unprecedented choices, as I mentioned, some of which are only possible due to dramatic shifts in public perception brought about by the pandemic. Their choices could have ripple effects large enough to shift actually the course of fiscal, financial, institutional, and political constraints that before kept the sustainable development goals off track, even before the pandemic. Though we all recognize that the world is in deep crisis, a forward-looking response to the pandemic could end an era where 1/3 of all food produced is wasted, while 1 of 10 people actually still go hungry. Where 10 times more is spent on fossil fuel subsidies than on renewable energy, and where more than 2 billion people live in fragility, conflict, and violence. It could transform the lives of those who were out of school, out of work, offline, and off the grid even before the virus spread. So keeping that optimistic potential in mind, United Nations Development Programme, UNDP or PNUD, has identified 7 COVID tipping points with the potential of reshaping our societies and our planet for the better. And then after that, Ola, I will end. 1, shift in behavior and social expectation have opened space to rethink a social contract for the 21st century, with accountable and inclusive governance and people as agents of change at the center. You recall UN, we the peoples. 2nd, a renewed focus on inequalities, which has been a stark display during the crisis, has ignited a renewed interest in universal health coverage, social protection floors, and more decisive action on gender equality and determinants for health. 3, there is an unprecedented opportunity to restructure economies and accelerate the move to renewable energy, green public procurement, and a drive for a green recovery which could grow global GDP by 98 trillion above business as usual by 2050. And 4, the surge in gender-based violence has added a momentum to the urgency of addressing gender discrimination and bias implicit in social norms, laws, policies, and everyday behavior. 5 out of 7, the wave of teleworking, teleschooling, telemedicine, and digital payments deployed during the pandemic are just the tip of the digital iceberg. So investment in digital transformation across the world, across communities, are driving recovery and setting the path for an accelerated beyond recovery. But we need to look at equality with regard to these investments. 6, the need to make progress towards peace and to build resilience against shocks in fragile and conflict and crisis-affected contexts has never been more acute. And finally, unmanageable debt, capital flight, trade stops threaten the recovery. If debt liquidity problems become debt solvency crisis, a debt standstill and a debt restructuring for all developing countries will be necessary, leading to the deeper question on how to grow economies in a more resilient and sustainable way. We are in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, but in any crisis, we also see a lot of opportunities. So let's build on those opportunities. Let's build on the people that we know are also part of Right Livelihoods network. People with ideas, people with a drive, and people who want to create a sustainable future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ulrika, for your optimistic, or I should say possibilistic outlook. You focus on the opportunities that there are, and they have become certainly even more important, but also hopefully more visible in this crisis. And we'll have ample opportunity to talk more about that, which I am looking very much forward to. And before that, we continue with our helicopter perspective. We talked about now the human development dimension and the enormous effect of the COVID crisis. And I would now like to introduce Alyn Ware, who is also a Right Livelihood Laureate of 2009. He received the award for his work on nuclear disarmament. And you might be surprised to hear, but won't be surprised after having heard him speak, that Alyn started his career as a kindergarten teacher. He is an amazingly pedagogical person who inspires many young people around the world, and at the same time is able to facilitate world leaders and especially parliamentarians as founder of the Parliamentary Network for Nuclear Disarmament to come together to advance the nuclear disarmament agenda. Alyn, please share your insights from that perspective on our topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ole, and it's wonderful to be joining this event, to be following after Ulrika, who gave a wonderful outline of the situation where we are at the moment, and the need to build cooperation and to build on the experiences that we're having during this pandemic to create a safer and healthier world, and one that is sustainable, and it's giving us some of those opportunities. So I'm coming in after that with focusing on one aspect of that, or two aspects, the peace and disarmament component, but they fit in very much with the sustainable development, resilient economies, environmental protection, etc. So I originally come from New Zealand, but I'm now joining you from Prague, and there are two people who have received the Right Livelihood Award from New Zealand. One you see here on the screen now was our Prime Minister, David Lange, who was the Prime Minister who shifted our policy from New Zealand from being part of the nuclear alliances and supporting nuclear deterrence to be nuclear free. He was also, as the Minister of Education, the person who started the introduction of peace education in New Zealand. And as Ole mentioned, I started my career as a teacher, and my early years was involved very much in developing the peace studies programs, which were then incorporated into the New Zealand curriculum, and in working on the campaign to remove nuclear weapons from New Zealand. So New Zealand, what were the nuclear weapons there? We didn't possess them ourselves, but they were coming into our ports on submarines like this, and on warships like this. And you can see we, as New Zealanders, started to rethink this idea of whether these weapons really did provide security or whether they were doing the opposite, creating insecurity. So here you see some of us going out in yachts and on surfboards to protest against the ships. We were in lots of the little boats. You know, we were very small compared to the big ships, but we were putting forward sort of the strength of the idea of peace rather than war. And we're using some creative techniques as well. Here you see the USS Bronstein, which was the last nuclear-armed ship to visit New Zealand. And this is in my hometown of Tauranga. The government at that time, which was a pro-nuclear government, this was before David Lange, was welcoming these ships to come in to prove that we were part of the big nuclear alliance, and was sending them around all the different little ports. And we managed to get on the front page by putting this peace sign above the ship that you see on the hill behind with torches. So we're using creativity to show an alternative of peace to the nuclear weapons, and it worked. Through our activities, we managed to, and with the help of David Lange and the Lange government, create a policy of opposition to nuclear weapons which lasts until today. As I mentioned, the other key thing which was involved in the Right Livelihood Award for me was also the development of peace education. That peace education in schools was not just about nuclear disarmament, about world peace. In fact, it started with peace in the home, peace in the school, helping resolve conflicts, with your brothers and sisters, or with your parents, or with others at school. That's where it started. And the basic principles of conflict resolution learned in the schools then help us as a society apply those principles into peace in the world. And that's where then I moved into my other career, which was going from peace education and disarmament in New Zealand to global peace and disarmament. But how did I get interested in this? It actually started with a poem. In high school, we studied this poem in English. It's from Honi Tufori, who was, as a very young soldier, went to Hiroshima just after the war. It was like just a week after, when the place was still in ruins. It was part of the forces, the occupying forces that came into Japan as Japan surrendered. And he was just shocked by the devastation with one bomb on that city of Hiroshima. So he wrote this poem. And the tree in our New Zealand, or Maori, our indigenous culture, represents life. So when he's speaking to the tree, he's speaking about life as a whole. And the poem goes, "Tree, let your arms fall. Raise them not sharply in supplication to the bright enhaloed cloud. Let your arms lack toughness and resilience, for this is no mere axe to blunt, nor fire to smother. Tree, let your naked arms fall, nor extend vain entreaties to the radiant ball. This is no gallant monsoon's flash, no dashing trade wind's blast. The fading green of your magic emanations shall not make pure again these polluted skies, for this is no ordinary sun." And to me, that really sort of woke me up, that here the nuclear weapon is actually the same reaction as happening in the sun, but 93 million miles away, which is where the sun is a safe distance for a nuclear reaction. Here on Earth, it's totally different. It turns from being a life-giving force to one that is against life. So, okay, we're just getting. So we actually included this poem in a resource guide on nuclear disarmament that we prepared for religious leaders and communities around the world, because art and poetry and ethics and morality and vision sort of go together. And that's part of what we're doing. One of the other things which really impacted me, being from New Zealand, which is in the Pacific, was the impact of the nuclear tests. This one you see on the right is from Moderator. And these tests deposited radiation throughout the Pacific, and it impacted on primarily women and children. And we had so many deformed babies, so many cancers, so many miscarriages and stillbirths. And here, some of them were very horrific, as Darlene Keju Johnson, who herself died from radiation, mentions. She was a director of family planning and talked about this thing that was like jellyfish babies. That's what they were like when they were giving birth, and it's just horrific. When I, as a kindergarten teacher, learned about this impact on children, it just changed my idea of what I wanted to do in the world. I knew that I had to work for the protection of children and the elimination of nuclear weapons. So that was quite some time ago. The nuclear tests are finished. Why are we still worried about nuclear weapons? Well, the problem is that the nuclear weapons have not gone away. There's still 13,000. There's approximately 1,400 on high alert. That means they're ready to be fired within minutes. There's a risk of nuclear weapons use by accident or miscalculation, or even by intent. That risk rises when there's conflicts between nuclear armed states. They could proliferate to other countries or either non-state actors. And there's also the possibility of infiltrating the command and communications systems. And Lastly, nuclear weapons budget consumes $100 billion per year. So early this year, in January, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists announced that the Doomsday Clock was coming even closer because of the dual risks of nuclear weapons and climate change, 100 seconds to midnight. But we don't hear about this a lot in the media. That's because the nuclear weapons are basically out of sight. They're hidden in submarines, under the ocean, or in secret nuclear bunkers. We generally don't have signs like this showing us, how to find a nuclear weapon. So people aren't really as engaged with it, even though it's a real risk. Even more so during the pandemic. And there are concerns about the vulnerability of nuclear command and control systems during that time, but more so, why should we be wasting so much money when we need to be addressing that money on the health and on economic reconstruction coming out of the COVID crisis? What would happen if we actually had a nuclear war? Well, if you have a look at this diagram here, that tiny wee little dot in the middle there, that represents all the firepower that was used in World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. All the bombs, all the artillery, 11 million tons worth of TNT. The combined explosive force in today's nuclear arsenal is about 600 times that. Oops. Which is 6,000 megatons. That's now expressed by that larger amount. So it's a huge amount just in the blast effect, let alone the radiation. Okay, that's some of the scary parts. What about some of the good news? Because there is progress on this front. One is that half the world is nuclear free. Most of the South Pacific, you see, are in nuclear weapon-free zone treaties, and also some areas of the Northern Hemisphere. So in general, most of the countries in the world have given up the idea that nuclear weapons provide security. How do we make the other half of the world nuclear weapons free? Well, there are proposals for nuclear weapon free zones in other regions like Northeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, and the Arctic. There's a building of global parliamentary support from parliamentarians, legislators from around the world, including from the nuclear armed states for nuclear abolition. And this is expressed in joint statements of parliamentarians, resolutions of the Interparliamentary Union, which is 178 parliaments, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There's a decision from the International Court of Justice that nuclear weapons, the threat or use, is generally illegal, and that there's an obligation to work for the total elimination. The picture down below is us outside the International Court of Justice just before it gave that decision. And there are a number of United Nations initiatives for nuclear disarmament, and I'll come to those. But there are some key barriers. One of those is that there's still a perception that security is provided by nuclear deterrence, that a wall of nukes can prevent attack. There's also the lobbying power of the nuclear weapons industry. And in order to keep the billions of dollars flowing to their coffers, they're doing a lot of lobbying of the US Congress or the US Parliament in order to get them to vote for new nuclear weapon systems. So we have to deal with both of those, the security perception that nuclear deterrence provides some security, and the lobbying power of the weapons industry. So the security, one is to challenge the perception itself. I mean, nuclear weapons may have provided a role during the Cold War when there were just two big powers, but the world is a totally different place now. It's multipolar. There are so many different countries. There's more countries with nuclear weapons. It's so much more dangerous. In some ways, and Ward Wilson has said this, nuclear weapons are a little bit like a penny farthing bicycle. So archaic, last century, very dangerous, and totally unsuited for our needs today. Doug Roach, former senator and Canadian disarmament ambassador, said even more, that nuclear weapons and all the armies in the world are irrelevant when it comes to the security issues of today. They couldn't stop COVID-19, so we have to think of new ways of security. If you look at the security, how does it relate to countries possessing nuclear weapons? There's a wonderful global peace index which measures 27 indicators of peace and security. And if you look at the countries here on the left that are nuclear weapon states, there's a couple in the middle, but most of them are way down the tail end of very low levels of peace and security, whereas the non-nuclear countries have a lot more peace and security. So how do we then persuade those with nuclear weapons or who think they still have a value? we can say there are better alternatives to gaining your security, to resolving conflicts. These include using diplomacy, mediation, arbitration, adjudication, etc. And there are mechanisms that are established to do this. The key one is the United Nations. The United Nations was established in order to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Article 2 of the UN Charter says that international disputes should be resolved peacefully and that members should refrain from the threat or use of force. Article 33 provides a range of different approaches that states not just can but should use in order to resolve their conflicts. Of course, that hasn't always been implemented, but sometimes it's worked very well. I'm going to give a few examples of where it's actually worked, a couple from our region. Here is...
It's absolutely fascinating to listen to you. It will be even more fascinating to have time to be discussing with you. And I would like to politely cut you short here and come to Gcina. And then I've already made a number of follow-up notes, and I think all of us have questions where we would love to pick up from the fascinating thoughts that you've been sharing. Would that be okay?
Okay.
Thank you. And with that, we're very excited, speaking in the framework of a poetry festival, to be hearing from a poet. Warm welcome to Gcina, prize-winning poet, author, and playwright from South Africa, who probably would have loved to be in Medellin right now, even more than we others, because it must be an amazing meeting also between poets from all around the world, and the power that you bring together to the festival. And by the way, with the various web resources that we have in the foundation, but also, of course, the Poetry Festival, those of you who are missing the intimacy of these readings of poetry everywhere in Medellin, I encourage you to also go to the Festival de Poesía de Medellin website and maybe watch some of that. I would love to invite you to share your view on the subject, Gcina. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, and it's a great honor to listen to the speakers, Alyn and Ulrika. Thank you so much. And when we are looking at a subject like this, at these strange times we're living in, for me, as a South African and as somebody from the African continent, I look at the way violence has been meted on us, whether we are willing to be part of the fighting or not, over the centuries. And you look at times when we are said to be free countries, we have removed the shackles of colonialism, and now we are democracies, and other monsters have found their way into our lives. The divide between the rich and the poor has been just growing and growing. That, for me, is something that is like a weapon on its own, the way people take away from the poor and enrich themselves. And also, I look at the fact that COVID-19 arrived at a time when people were so happy, shouting about the fourth industrial revolution, the fact that so much is going to change, so much of our lives are going to be better because of the fourth industrial revolution. But look at illiteracy. Still, illiteracy, something that is not even an issue in many of the first world countries. When I started our literacy campaign in 2001, Nozincwadi, Mother of Books, I thought it was something that was going to be for a year or two, but it's been going on and on, the number of schools that still don't have libraries. So some of the nuclear weapons and other world threats don't even reach those audiences because information is not available. Even at a time like this, when people think that you can communicate and send information on the internet, you can Google this and Google that, people do not have Wi-Fi, they don't have internet connection. It's just not possible to get that information, that access. And if you look at the violence, South Africa has been known as one of the most violent countries in the world. So people don't even need bombs and other terrifying nuclear weapons to decimate one another. Just knives, ropes to hang their lovers and children. I look at the threat towards the woman race. It's like there's this growing hatred. It's like a time bomb. Like we want to destroy women. We don't want women. Women are life givers. I do not know how the human race can exist without women. We are the bringers of life. And the amount of hatred towards women is unbelievable. This week that is culminating today, it is Monday, the number of women that have been killed just in the past 7 days in my country. This is like a two streams running concurrently. COVID-19, we hear the number of people that have died because of COVID-19, and then there are no numbers exactly that are being rolled out of women and children that have been killed. So to disarm, we need, for me, I think we need a state of emergency to focus on the violence meted against women. And then you look at the discussions that are taking place about fracking in South Africa. They've been trying so much to come, companies from Australia, they want to come and do some fracking in South Africa. And ordinary people in small villages are fighting against this thing. And our government is not bothered about it. They just bulldozing, and they're deciding, I don't know what money they're going to get, but it's going to be gotten by the big people. The ordinary citizens, their lives are going to be affected. The diseases that come with all of these things are going to affect ordinary people who already are dealing with unemployment. We are dealing with a lack of medicine in hospitals and clinics in small communities. And then you look at an issue like there are schools where children have got to cross bridges by swimming across because there's not a bridge. They cross a river when there are floods. And children are swept away in the floods trying to get an education. So these are the things that we are dealing with. When we're talking about peace, without justice, without striving for equality, I don't know how do you spell the word peace. I don't know how you spell that. So it is so sad that we're living at a time like this when actually it is possible. But the greed, the way people are just thinking about accumulating personal wealth and caring for themselves and those closest to them and not caring about the greater good, the greater community is affecting where we are today. And then I look at the fact that when we are talking about disarming and talking about peace, I rewind to the times of apartheid. When we were fighting for freedom, we used to go to public spaces and create peace parks. And the riot police, this was a foreign concept to them. A peace park, what's that? They would come with their guns and shoot and destroy whatever we had created. Some years ago, I started with my daughter to create a space here in our home where we live now that has become a peace garden. We've got 52 languages of the word peace written on the walls. And now I have poetry, like when we did our first event of the World Poetry Movement, we did poetry in the Peace Garden. We have jazz in the Peace Garden. We have got indigenous music happening in the Peace Garden. We have got times when we sing, we pray for this world peace that is so desperately needed, for the scales to fall off, for people to understand that not only are we waging war against women, but waging war against Mother Nature. If Mother Nature is not respected and not protected, we are the ones who are going to be the losers. Nature can regenerate. whether we are here or not, we are the ones who are going to be losers. So we pray for that too. We work towards that. Some of our sister organizations are big on renewable and recycling, and so we never stop learning. Our organization has to have these sister organizations because we've got these audiences that we can share this information with. What are the I do not know as the director of the Namasiko, I make sure that information is distributed and shared to the people who come to work with us, whether to listen to stories, to music, to poetry, because there's more to the work that happens on our stages. And something that has happened more recently is since last year, we were given permission after bugging them a lot, the city of Durban, we were given permission to have a storytelling tree. It's an old wild fig tree. And under the storytelling tree, we meet once a month, we tell stories there, we do history telling. Because I believe a nation that doesn't have its own cultural heritage, its own history, its own sense of identity, doesn't have a soul. Unless there are people who are cultural and heritage activists like us, we're going to be just going on and on saying we've got a highway over there, we've got a new stadium over there, we've got a brand new fancy airport over there. When we do not have a soul, what good is that? That is one of the reasons then that I respect and honor so much the work done by the International Poetry Festival in Medellin. It's extremely important for these oasis spaces to exist, to connect. And the fact that we can speak like this coming from different countries and different continents, it's something that we should embrace, but also make sure that whatever ideas we have are reaching many communities where we might not be able to reach them live like this, but we can disseminate that information. It can go further and further. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be with you, to be discussing these kinds of topics. We are really under threat. People with big monies don't only think about themselves, they also think about who can they destroy, who can they climb on top of in order to feel more powerful. And I don't know powerful for what, because when destruction happens, it doesn't choose.
Thank you for your powerful words, Gcina. And I see when I look away from the camera, I'm looking at my other monitor, and we already have a number of questions coming in from our audience and comments. And I encourage you who are listening to us to continue sending us questions through the various platforms. Before we take the time to look at them, I would love to engage our fantastic speakers in a discussion with each other. And it's probably best if I just shut up and let you talk to each other, because there is so much value and beauty in what you're saying. But I couldn't resist to at least reflect back a kind of little kaleidoscope of what I heard listening to you for the last half hour, with Ulrika's call for renewed multilateralism and her hope and the opportunity that she sees for a new social contract and for a green recovery. I'm interested maybe also to hear more in discussion between all of you of the Secretary General's call for an armistice in the wake of COVID. And then obviously it was amazing to hear about the nuclear weapons money project from Alyn, the idea to what could UNDP be doing? What could Africa and South Africa be doing if all this nuclear weapons money was invested in a sensible way in development and in a green recovery? I'm mindful of cutting Alyn short when he was just starting to talk about the positive developments, and it would be fascinating to hear more about that. Gcina, you talk about we should declare a state of emergency when it comes to the violence on women and the violence on Mother Nature that is becoming even worse in the framework of the crisis. Other monsters have found their way into our lives, you shared with us. And without justice, how do we even spell the word peace? So I would love to invite the three of you to engage more deeply, and maybe start by asking each other or commenting on what got you thinking when you were listening to each other. So the floor is for you to take, for the three of you.
Yeah. I was listening to Alyn talking about the fact that they were able to have a movement and take on the big ships that were coming in. And sometimes people feel like you are so small. What can I do? Just good old me. And me and my friends, we are so small. We don't have weapons. We don't have guns. We don't have this. There's not much we can do. How did you build up the momentum to be able to take on these multinationals who've got so much power and money?
Well, thank you. And just a little history of activism in New Zealand. The main campaign to stop the nuclear armed ships come in and make New Zealand nuclear free started in around 1982. The few years just before that, the main campaigns that we were involved in was actually the anti-apartheid issue, because New Zealand was also supporting the apartheid regime by inviting the Springboks, the rugby team, to come and play in New Zealand. And actually, that was my actual first big protest, was helping organise, awareness issues about apartheid in South Africa, and say, until we get rid of apartheid in South Africa, we shouldn't be playing rugby, support the sports boycott. And that was big. I think one of the things in New Zealand which is interesting is that during that time, the Springbok tour in 1981, everybody put aside the other issues and came and cooperated on that one, so that we actually supported each other. And then after that, we all then cooperated for a few years on the nuclear disarmament one. So people sort of worked together on that. Then we realized there was racism in our own country, so we had a whole issue on the Treaty of Waitangi and our racism in New Zealand, and we all cooperated on that. And I think that's something with a small country where we feel we're a community, even if we sometimes have different opinions or different experiences, we talk a lot with each other, and then so we often cooperate on the issues. So when it came to the nuclear weapons, that was the principal issue that we were dealing with for a few years, and so it wasn't just going out onto the water. That was the visual part of it. We were doing a lot of work behind the scenes. We set up peace organizations in basically every little township around the country. We went to the city councils and declared our city councils a nuclear weapon-free zone, something we could do locally. We went to our political parties, and we went to all of them, even the ones that were really supporting nuclear weapons. We still went and talked with them, and eventually they also changed. And I think it's that engagement and respecting people, even if they have different points of view, is really important. And I think that's social change happens, I think, with a number of different activities. It's not just one activity. It's using the arts, it's using the culture, it's using the politics, it's using education, it's engaging women also and empowering women, it's empowering youth voices. We had a very strong women's peace movement also that was active. All these things can help with the social change. And I think that's a good model, I think, for other areas.
Thank you. It's fascinating.
I think also the connection between what we have presented and wanted to discuss is incredibly important. And I would also like to remind us about the Charter of the UN that says we the people. It doesn't say we the governments, it says we the people. And that we can actually do this kind of change that you're describing now. And I'm also thinking about the importance of bringing back the discussion about human security. That was also part of the Human Development Report early on, and how that would then speak to the possibilities to engage citizens, but also decision makers throughout the world in the kind of investments that we would need to do to really get human security. And then I'm also speaking about the violence against women that we see now also with all the closure in society increasing across the world in all countries. And I really believe that we need to remind people about the investments that are going into a future that is not sustainable, whether it's in arms or in fossil fuel subsidies or other areas, and wake them up and shake them up a bit and say that it's actually up to us to take the kind of decisions that we need to take now to invest differently. So I believe that while we would never wish for a situation like we have with the pandemic, it has actually made people more aware about the vulnerabilities that we have in our societies. People are concerned, and how we can also turn that concern and anger perhaps and disappointment into something constructive. I believe we can. There are a lot of populists and protectionists and nationalists, and then there are the kind of globalists, but there are a lot of people in between who I actually believe that would want to engage in a different way because of the situation we're in. And then, of course, the kind of figures and facts that you put forward, Alyn, are incredibly important for people to understand and know. As you said, also, Gcina, I mean, people are not fully aware. Where is our money going? Where are the investments done? And could they be done in line with sustainable development goals instead?
Can you
give a little background on that specifically, Alyn? I think, I mean, you did calculation. You can tell us how much is going into the nuclear weapons industry. It's just one example of armaments industries, and what does that look like compared to the money that is available for education, development, etc.
Yeah, I've just shared a slide. Do you see this, where we actually looked at the money that's going into the nuclear weapons over the next 10 years? The budgets are, what they're preparing to spend is $1 trillion. That's 1 million times $1 million. And all the things that it could go to instead of going into the nuclear weapons. So this is all, not just one or the other, it's all of these together could be funded by that money, feeding the 780 million.
I don't think we see a slide, at least I don't, so we need to rely on your narrative talent.
Yeah, okay.
I'll stop the sharing then. Okay, sorry. Technical problems with the sharing. I'll just have to escape.
You say that the 1 million times 1 million can be used not just to fund in one aspect of sustainable development, but...
So we have, I'm not sure why the slide didn't work, but we've done a picture graphic of a missile that shows how much you could spend on ending hunger, on building hospitals, on providing clean water, on providing clean cooking because of the pollution and the health problems of dirty styles of cooking, all those together, basically funding a large portion of the sustainable development goals through the nuclear weapons budget alone. $100 billion a year. Now, the combined military budget is 20 times more than that, 1.9 trillion a year. It's a huge, phenomenally huge amount of money that's going into the military. So again, one is trying to shift the budgets. And I think Ulrika is correct that the pandemic has actually shocked, some of those in power who go, oh dear, we've got a real problem here. So that some countries have actually decided to lower their military budget. South Korea has, and Thailand has already. A few others have, specifically to help for the public health and economic recovery from COVID-19. But we have to make sure that that's spread around other countries, because other countries were also talking about this, but then the arms manufacturers and the defense establishment came in and said, no, don't cut the military budget. We need this. So it's not doesn't just happen from rational and good thoughts. We actually have to campaign for this. And I think Ulrika is quite correct. We have to educate people that you can make a difference. How do you do that? One is through talking to your parliamentarians, putting this to your city councillors, making this a public issue. Another one is looking at the investments. And again, Ulrika is quite correct. There are ridiculous subsidies and investments going into fossil fuels. There are ridiculous investments going into weapons and into nuclear weapons. Many of us are involved in investing, whether it's our own personal investments, our banks, or our cities have investment funds, or our universities have investment funds, or even our governments have sovereign wealth funds. We can encourage those investment funds to stop investing in fossil fuels, to stop investing in military, to stop investing in nuclear weapons. It's not that difficult to get them to do that. Already many have done that. And so we can use that experience, and that experience can help others who want to do that as well. And we have a lot of those examples on our website, nuclearweaponsmoney.org, for anyone who's wanting to try and move, or their church may be investing, or their city, or that we can help that. So definitely investments. But the education is important. We created this. This is where the money is now going. This is a $1 million note. And we printed off 1 million of these. That equals 1 trillion. You think 1 million of these That's where the money's going at the moment. That's what it should be going instead. And over a week, we tried counting out the nuclear weapons budget. There was like 100 of us. We were doing all day, all night. We couldn't do it. 1 million of those is an incredible amount of money, and that's the nuclear weapons budget. We were taking it from the nuclear weapons and putting into baskets for the Sustainable Development Goals. They got totally full. There was just too much money for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the people who participated in this go like, wow, that really shows what the money could do. So this is something, you know, we carry these around and show to people and say, look, this is where the money could go instead. These sorts of fun things, I think, can help get into people's heads that we can do something about this. It's not beyond our control. It's not too complicated. It's not just about, you know, the financial experts. We can be involved in shifting the money from bad things to good things.
I'd like to bring in, even already at this stage, some of our listeners' questions, because they fit so well with the discussion that you are having. I mean, basically what you're saying is, Ulrika is saying, what Alyn is saying, it's down to citizen parts, down to mobilization. It's also down to, you know, making your voice heard and the importance of education for that. So a question to Gcina and to all, but specifically to Gcina, is the best, and it's phrased in a somewhat militaristic way, but I'll put it like that. What is the best weapon for change? Your voice or something else? Can you talk about that?
My voice or something else? What is the something else? I guess not only with your voice, you can use your voice, but a collective voice is much more powerful. And also the way we campaign for a certain cause is extremely important, to know that when we are fighting for something, we are not destructive. I don't know if that something else means to be destructive in order to be heard, to burn things, to destroy things, to break this down. I'm not for breaking down, I'm for building. I always say the work we do, we are nation builders. And so for me, we use our voices, yes, but also let's find ways of being active. Like the space that we have used, that we have acquired here in Durban, that is now the place where the storytelling tree is. It was terrible, full of rubbish, looking ugly, and nobody taking care of it. We can go around demonstrating. No, so much energy marching and saying nothing. Can we just use the energy building something? And so now the space is beautiful, it's alive. I'm that kind of soldier. I'm the kind of soldier who make things happen. I've got two hands, I've got energy, I'm alive. And people who are ready to come and work with us, let's go and do it. Let's get on and do it. One of the things, for instance, that is upsetting me a lot, we promote so much tourism in my city, and buildings are falling apart. The streets are dirty. And I'm embarrassed about that. I can go around moaning or go on Facebook and, what a pity, and what is that going to do for me? So for me, it's for us to get together, and artists of the city to go to the city. That's our next campaign now, to deal with the recycling, to deal with the cleaning up and making sure the spaces where people are, because it gives you pride in the place that you call home. And also people, I don't know who came up with this idea that people should throw rubbish in rivers. Rivers are the veins of your body, you know, are the veins. And if we throw rubbish into the rivers, what are we going to do? We can't live without water. Water is life. And even now, during this COVID-19, people say we must wash hands, and they invite people like us, do a video about hand washing. If people don't even have water to drink, where are they going to get water to wash hands, to be compliant with all the rules and recommendations to combat this coronavirus? So for me, I'm about doing more than shouting. If I'm shouting, I'll be singing or doing poetry or telling a story.
We the people, Ulrika, but in fact, it is the governments that decide. And if Alyn says it's easy to do mobilization, and also Gcina, you're telling us, you know, you can go out and do things. We know that many governments now are curtailing the freedom of civil society to act even more? How do you reconcile that with, how do you bring more we, the people, into the UN and UNDP?
Well, I think it's good to remind ourselves that actually the charter says we the people. And when governments took somewhat responsible decisions back in 2015, when the Secretary General said that the stars must have been aligned because we had the decision on the Sustainable Development Goals, on the Paris Agreement on climate change, and also the financing for development coming together. That was a process where the UN opened up in a way that they had not done before. And we can simply not make it as the UN only with governments. We need to maintain that openness in relation to civil society and other actors. And I find it quite fascinating because I also see that a number of actors, also investors being responsible and actually wanting to do investments in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of the Paris Agreement, they're actually now coming to the UN. And they want to work on a platform arranged by the Secretary General for sustainable impact investment for real. And I think that these are decision makers in the private sector that have fully understood what we're up against, that want to take personal responsibility in a different way than we see before. They are, of course, not yet enough of these people, but we see a movement and people coming together and defending also the rules-based world order that we really need. Now, with regard to governments not respecting basic human rights, civic and political rights, and using the pandemic as a way to close down discussions, that will hit back on societies. What we have seen and what we also saw and presented also ahead of the pandemic was a world with increasing inequality, with increasing lack of trust in decision makers, in institutions and governments. And these societies are not working. A lot of social uprise will not create well-functioning economies or really invite for foreign direct investments into developing countries or any of the other countries of the world. So I think it's really time for decision makers, for governments, for the private sector to understand that if they want to have a sustainable economy, that has to come with a different social contract between decision makers and citizens. With more equality, and not least, I think what you're saying, Gcina, we have spoken a lot about that in the UN, the need for pushback against the pushback. We see an increasing gender bias in many countries now, when we have actually seen progress with regard to gender equality. It's a pushback now. So the economic sustainability, the social sustainability, dealing with increasing inequality, and then, of course, the respect of the borders of our planet. Of course, we can't throw trash into our rivers. I mean, it's if the very vein that is making us who we are as human beings. So it's really for people, for planet. But there is no other way, I think, to get
to reach the goals we are discussing here. Don't you think the UN needs to reform?
The UN is a mirror of the world and the decision makers that we have, for good and bad. Of course, as institutions, we also need to reform. And the Secretary General, he has set up a very ambitious plan for reform. And there are a lot of things happening. Within the development system where I work, where UNDP operates, there are a lot of things happening with regard to reform. Increased cooperation between the UN agencies and beyond, because, of course, the money is not really with the UN. I think that's important. Perhaps when you represent a civil society organization, you feel, wow, these organizations, they have a lot of money. But look at WHO. They have a budget equivalent to medium-sized hospital in New York. The expectations that we have and should have in relation to what the WHO can do and must do in the future, they are incredibly high, and they should continue to be. But of course, then we need to look at the money that we're investing into our global institutions. And we need also the UN to be coordinated also with the development banks, but the broader range of actors, as I said, also the investors that we have been speaking about. So yes, the UN has to reform. We need to get the support from decision makers to be able to reform. And of course, also as civil servants, we need to be part of this. A lot of things happen. Still, we need to improve, of course.
Alyn wants to come in on that one.
Yeah, I want to come in on that because, I understand that the UN is not a perfect system. No political system is perfect. What And of course, we can improve the political systems, but we don't have to wait for a perfect political system to use it to the best of our ability. And there are so many ways that civil society can use and engage with the United Nations. If you have a good democratic government like we do in New Zealand, we can go to our government and suggest ideas and resolutions and initiatives, and our government will take those up. And I know Sweden does that quite well as well. And we often are working with the Swedish government and the New Zealand government on initiatives cooperatively. But even if your government is not a good one and you're actually wanting to challenge your government, you can do that through the United Nations, through civil society organizations. We have processes for actually challenging the governments and their human rights records through the UN Human Rights Committee. And we have access to do that. We have direct access to come into the United Nations and engage in the various different issues physically when the physical is open physically, but now even more electronically. And in the 75th anniversary, there's so many online portals for engaging with the UN through the survey, which is the quick 1-minute survey you can do at UN 75, through engaging in the civil society consultations for the anniversary, through all the different programs. So I say, look at the opportunities that you got and use those. We did that when we wanted to take a case to the International Court of Justice against the most powerful countries in the world for their nuclear weapons policies. We did it as civil society. We went around, we talked with like-minded governments, we talked with organizations, we talked with the UN Secretariat about what's the best way of doing it, and we managed to get to the court and we won the case. There are so many other examples of citizen-led initiatives that are engaging with the UN. But I do also want to emphasize what Ulrika mentioned, is that the UN is a phenomenal institution that was established for the peoples of the world, for peace, for human rights, for development, and yet its budget is minuscule. The entire UN budget, the annual budget, is 6.5 billion, I think. That's about the same as the New York police force. Ulrika mentioned, the World Health Organization budget is about the same as an average size hospital in New York. It's an incredibly minuscule budget compared to all the tasks it's got to do. And we need to put that into our legislators, our parliamentarians, our government's mind, that they should spend less on military and more on the UN and give it more support. Because this is the tool that we have to build the main tool for building common security and cooperative approaches to these global solutions.
Gcina, you want to come in on that one?
It feels like to me, governments, when there's a goal they're fighting towards, or when they are campaigning for election, they say all the right things and they make all the right noises to win people's trust. And then once they are in those positions, they just face the other way and they forget about the people who voted for them. And so when you look at what the United Nations has to do and how it can be, it's almost like there's no middleman between the United Nations and ordinary citizens in townships, in villages, in small towns. It's something that we see on TV. The director of the United Nations said, and then we hear that quotation and that's about it. And then once in a while, there's some president or representative from the African continent who happened to say something at the United Nations. Oh, that's interesting. And in general, it's not on our everyday consciousness. And I'm not sure what needs to be done for that to take place. I think maybe the United Nations, the fact that there are these digital platforms where we try and connect regularly, maybe there should be a way of, when we access information from the United Nations, we keep reminding people, listen, there's the United Nations corner, check it out. This is what they are doing. This is what the goals are. This is what has been achieved thus far. Because even the Millennium Goals are not on the top of the agenda. They are talked about when they say it's Child Protection Week, and suddenly there's frenzy to focus on that. And then it's World Environment Day and frenzy on that. And so there's no momentum that is being maintained in order for all of us to be conscious of what work the United Nations is doing. I think unless we have a shift in our thinking, in terms of not only money that must be spent in the United Nations, but using our platforms to I don't know whether campaign is the right word, but yeah, something close to campaign to push for the United Nations to be more visible than it is in small spaces, like taking the light to the top of the mountain kind of thing.
One of those areas where could be a lot more work out in the field, and I know the Secretary General wants there to be, is in assisting the implementation of the call for the global ceasefire. He has appointed, a number of special envoys to be out in the field to meet with warring parties, to help them to sort of agree to a ceasefire and then to sort of negotiate, agreements that will then end those conflicts or transform the conflicts into peace processes. But it takes a lot of resources out in the field. It doesn't just happen instantly. And that's where, I think, the idea of having more people out in the field to help advance, the key projects and initiatives of the United Nations would be very good if there could be resources to do that.
Yeah, and also, as we have said, to really connect also what the UN does also more with civil society. And there I actually think that there is also room for improvement. I can see even within my own organization that, when speaking about the top of the mountain, sometimes the UN functionaries are also kind of, on top of things, but also a bit up-nosed and don't really engage locally. I think that's incredibly important to open up and to say, as we have been saying with the Sustainable Development Goals, we cannot do this on our own. It's not the United Nations, it's not the governments even though they are and should be held accountable, but it's actually the broad range of actors. And what I also wanted to take the opportunity to say that the UN is still an incredibly important source of knowledge. We know in this world of today, with fake news traveling around, not least in times of COVID, that knowledge is so important. And I really want, for those of you who listen, also to tell you that please use our data and the knowledge that we have on our platforms. That's incredibly important for decision makers also to have as a basis for decisions. And UNDP has a very well-functioning website. The socioeconomic assessments that we have been doing, leading on that response on behalf of the Secretary General and the funds and programs is up and updated also on our website. So please make use of them, engage with us and work with us.
Well, thank you. And you see me looking with some regret at my second screen here and all the fascinating comments that could make us continue this discussion for at least a couple more hours, some of them very specific and some really philosophical. And I will share some of them maybe just as comments before we end in a bit more than 10 minutes. But starting to wrap up, I would like to ask the three of you individually to maybe just share again with the, the helicopter perspective that we started with. What are the one or two takeaways that you take with you from this conversation that you heard from your co-panelists with the focus on our topic of world peace and disarmament? And it looks like we lost Gcina temporarily, so maybe Ulrika, you want to get started?
So I think I've said it already. I mean, we are in an unprecedented crisis, but hopefully this is also a wake-up call for decision makers, but not least also for people who understand the importance of the world coming together. We have seen with the presentations here that there are a lot of investments being done, but they are being done in the wrong future, the future that we don't want to see and that we don't want to be part of. And I think that we can take the opportunity to have these kind of conversations, to have a strong push towards decision makers, the broad range of decision makers, as we mentioned, both, of course, governments, locally, regionally, nationally, but also the international institutions. And also, of course, the important economic sector that also needs to shift, because there are a lot of, as we know, strong interests that we've mentioned here. But even the strongest of interests, they are affected by public opinion. this is really the time to speak up, as so many of the people in your network have been doing, and to bring forward the best practices. There are actually good things happening, as we heard, countries taking decisions to do things differently. And there, I think also that United Nations can be a very strong platform to share best practices and shine the light on both people, but also governments taking responsible decisions in the right direction. And I also wanted, as we have not spoken that much about gender equality, but I do think that gender equality needs to be at the heart of the change that we need to see. I think that there is a strong movement that is being pushed back, and that could actually also make change happen. So the women's movement, the green movement, if they come together also with those who also see the importance of disarmament, I think that we are unstoppable. And then, of course, on the foundation of all of this, human rights and the belief that people can change the world.
Thank you, Ulrika. We keep temporarily losing speakers here, not those who have been speaking yet, though, so it hasn't been a problem. Gcina, what are the thoughts that you take with you from our conversation?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, yeah. Is causing trouble here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Gcina.
And now we cannot hear you. Your picture is frozen, so I first give the floor to Alyn.
Well, thank you. I might pick up on a question that I see in the comment box from Paul Walker, who's another Right Livelihood Laureate and has been one of the leaders in the elimination of chemical weapons globally. So it's great to see him as participating here. And Paul asks about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is up for review next year, and this new United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And whether this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons will enter into force and what impact that might have. Very quickly, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is something that non-nuclear states negotiated in 2017. None of the nuclear armed states participated, none of the allied states except Netherlands, but they've now pulled out anyway. So it's just basically a declaration type treaty of the non-nuclear states. I think it's a good thing for the non-nuclear states to do, but I don't think it'll have any impact on the nuclear armed states or the allied states, because it doesn't address either of the key issues that I raised in my presentation about why these states still have nuclear weapons. Their security perception, that they provide some form of security, and the lobbying of the nuclear weapons industry. What I think will probably have more impact in moving the nuclear armed states forward on this would be the Stockholm Initiative, which was set up by Sweden and includes a mix of non-nuclear states and those that are under extended nuclear deterrence. They don't possess nuclear weapons, but they're part of this thinking that you need nuclear weapons for security. And I think the Stockholm Initiative sets up as a solutions approach, as a way of how do we engage with those who still think they need nuclear weapons in order to get them to give up the nuclear weapons, as opposed to just a challenge protest approach, which is what the treaty is more a protest approach. The nuclear weapon states are bad, nuclear weapons are bad, you should join the treaty. The Stockholm Sweden approach is more of a dialogue. Why, how can we get them to reduce the role of nuclear weapons? So I think the Stockholm Initiative will have more of an impact on engaging the nuclear armed states and to move the agenda forwards. And I'm really excited to see New Zealand, my country, as part of the Stockholm Initiative, as is Germany, Japan, South Korea, and a number of other key countries.
Well, I would then like to just read some of the questions / comments to put them on the table, and we will need, and I hope we can find another digital way to continue the discussion on our various social media platforms. I'm sure our technology people will make that possible. Can we trust the UN in this is one of the questions. And we have some technical questions about the various nuclear treaties. Education is the main weapon to create a better future. There's a lot of discussion about inequality, about gender questions that were also taken up by our speakers. World peace is not a matter of nuclear weapons. It is inequality and ignorance promoted around the poor countries. We as consumers need to change our behavior too. There's a lot of thanks also from the audience to the organizers and to our speakers.
Oh,
violence comes up again. We now seem to have you with us again, Gcina, and maybe you have last thoughts to share with us. Let's try once more if we get them through the digital connection.
Yeah, we got disconnected. I'm not sure what happened there. I am very grateful to be part of this discussion. And also, I'm also learning so much from hearing my co-panelists on this topic. I wish for us to find a way of connecting more on these issues so that this information can be shared with some of our local communities. I think that's extremely important. And number two, I'd like to congratulate the International Poetry Festival of Medellin for making this platform possible, because when you hear that COVID-19 is here, this festival is cancelled, that festival is cancelled, and sometimes there's this lack of hope and lack of optimism. This is another place where hope is reborn. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And we've got work to do, of course. It's never over. In South Africa, we say the struggle is never over.
Well, thank you so much, Gcina. I'm really grateful to all of you for an amazing discussion. Towards the end, the plan was that we would have announced a surprise and Gcina would have shared a song with us. And I think with your unstable connection now, we are not doing that on this platform because we want to do justice to your art. And I hope again, and I promise here that our social media platforms will share this song properly produced and that we will also continue the debate here. I really want to thank you panelists. I want to thank the audience that participated so much that we couldn't do justice even to their comments. I want to thank all the wonderful people behind the Poetry Festival, translators, readers, presenters, interpreters, the important technicians, and a great thanks to our supporters in Medellin, the Mayor's Office of Medellin, the Secretariat of the Citizen Culture, the Ministry of Culture of Colombia at the federal level, and the National Program for Cultural Consultation. Please continue to engage with the festival. The festival, as you see, is digital and is extended. You'll find on their website a number of highly interesting discussions and, of course, poetry and culture. A few more of them will also be produced jointly between the Right Livelihood Foundation and the festival, and many more are coming up over the coming weeks. And from our side as Right Livelihood Foundation, we already look forward to the 1st of October when we will be announcing the 41st batch of Right Livelihood Laureates. So stay tuned. Thank you. Muchas gracias a todas y todos. All the best.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the privilege.
Best of luck, everyone. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
...40 años del Premio Nobel Alternativo. Diálogos Right Livelihood Award. Prometeo.